Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, let's follow the events of episode 96. In the previous episode, Qin Mu said goodbye to Granny C and set out with Emperor Yang Feng, while Long Qilin followed behind them. In order to help the emperor recover from his injuries, Qin Mu taught him the creation spirit art from the Great Education Heavenly Devil scripture, as well as the Overlord Body 3 elixir technique. He instructed the emperor to cultivate while traveling. At first, Emperor Yang Feng was skeptical. However, after trying the techniques, he quickly felt his strength and complexion improve. Qin Mu explained that if the emperor continued cultivating, and later combined the techniques with the creation ghost god technique to strengthen his soul, along with medicinal treatment, there was a chance that both his physical and spiritual injuries could eventually recover completely. As they traveled through various prefectures and counties, the situation throughout the Duyan Kang Empire became even more chaotic. The sects that had once been suppressed by the imperial court were now rising again. They seized land and property, forced ordinary people to work their fields, and reclaimed territories that had previously belonged to the government. Meanwhile, the disaster caused by the endless snow and famine had not yet ended. People were starving and freezing to death everywhere, yet the local authorities had stopped providing disaster relief. The actions of these sects were like pouring oil onto an already raging fire, making the situation across the Duyan Kang Empire increasingly unstable. Emperor Yang Feng did not say much. Instead, he quietly cultivated as hard as he could, hoping to restore his divine treasures and regain his cultivation. When they arrived in Yang Prefecture, Qin Mu took the emperor directly to the governor's residence. The governor immediately recognized Qin Mu as the leader of the Heavenly Saint cult, but he did not recognize the true identity of the person accompanying him. Qin Mu arranged for Emperor Yang Feng to be taken care of and then asked about the situation in the capital. The governor of Yang Prefecture, who was also the hall master of the Pure Clothing Hall of the Heavenly Saint cult, Duanmu Jing, told Qin Mu that the situation in the capital was extremely dangerous. Large numbers of Taoist priests from the Tao sect and monks from the Great Thunderclap Monastery had already entered the capital. The Tao Master and the Tathagata had even issued an imperial decree recognizing the Crown Prince as the Pure Emperor, with his coronation scheduled for the 6th day of the 3rd month. The Crown Prince currently held enormous power as regent. His agents were operating throughout the empire. Whenever they found someone who resembled Emperor Yang Feng, they immediately killed them to prevent the real emperor from returning. The aristocratic families in the capital were also gradually falling under the control of Buddhism and Taoism. Many powerful clans now had monks and Taoist priests living inside their estates, but they did not dare to resist. The capital had become a gathering place for countless factions and sects. It was no longer truly the domain of Emperor Yang Feng. The Crown Prince had also announced that he intended to restore the ancient system of government and return land to the various sects. On top of that, the Lang Kutu kingdom had sent envoys to negotiate about the border conflict. The Crown Prince had directly ceded 16 prefectures in Yunlu to the Lang Kutu kingdom in exchange for peace. The Man tribe had also sent envoys to negotiate compensation and territorial concessions. After hearing all of this, Qin Mu merely gave a cold laugh. He believed the Crown Prince was turning himself into a complete failure. The 6th day of the 3rd month was supposed to be an auspicious day for the Crown Prince's coronation. But in Qin Mu's eyes, it was simply a perfect day for killing. Qin Mu then asked about the whereabouts of the national preceptor. When he learned that there was finally a clue, he immediately prepared a list of medicinal herbs and instructed Duanmu Jing to have everything delivered to Qin Prefecture. After that, Qin Mu took Emperor Yang Feng and Long Qilin and left Yang Prefecture in search of the national preceptor. At this point, Emperor Yang Feng still had not eaten enough. But the moment he heard that they were going to meet the national preceptor, he immediately agreed to leave. He wanted to personally ask the national preceptor why he had disappeared for so many days. Qin Mu placed the emperor on Long Qilin's back and continued traveling. Long Qilin ran continuously for 2 days before finally reaching a mountainous region. The air here was scorching hot. Divine light constantly rose from a valley, spreading into the sky. Emperor Yang Feng immediately detected the scent of divine blood in the air. Qin Mu led him into the valley. Sure enough, they discovered a huge pool of blood. Beside the pool stood a wooden house, and behind it was a small river. The divine blood had heated the river until steam continuously rose from its surface. In the middle of this dangerous place, there was a strangely peaceful scene. A woman wearing a white fur coat stood beside the river. She was pregnant. Next to her was a middle-aged man holding a wooden washing stick and doing laundry on a stone. The two people were none other than the national preceptor of Duyan Kang and his wife. The moment Emperor Yang Feng saw the national preceptor, he immediately rushed toward him. But then he noticed that blood was still flowing from the national preceptor's chest. The emperor, who had already lost all of his cultivation, could not hold back his tears. The man who had once stood among the strongest figures in the entire Duyan Kang Empire had now been reduced to such a miserable condition. The national preceptor also noticed that Emperor Yangfeng had lost all of his cultivation, and his heart was filled with sorrow. The two men had once stood at the very peak of Duyan Kang's power and strength. Now, one had lost his cultivation, while the other carried a divine wound that could not be healed. After entering the wooden house, the national preceptor explained what had happened. After leaving Little Jade Capital, he had wanted to investigate the source of the disaster. During his investigation, he encountered a mysterious god carrying a gourd. That god had released the disaster from the gourd. The two sides then fought a terrifying battle. Although the national preceptor managed to seriously injure the mysterious god, he himself suffered even more severe injuries. Because his wife was pregnant, he could not continue traveling. Therefore, the two of them had no choice but to hide in this valley. Qin Mu examined the national preceptor's wounds and immediately realized that they had been caused by a god. Divine intent and divine abilities were still embedded inside the wound. Even powerful medicines and dragon saliva could only heal the surface. They could not eliminate the true source of the injury. Qin Mu finally came up with a special method. He took out the sword pill given to him by Deaf Grandpa and activated its sword light. He then directed the sword light around the national preceptor's wound. The sword light immediately pierced into the pool of divine blood. The entire pool shook violently. 3 earth-shattering explosions erupted one after another. The sword light was shattered, and even the sword pill was damaged. However, the power contained within the divine blood managed to suppress the divine abilities remaining inside the national preceptor's wound. Qin Mu applied more dragon saliva to the injury. This time, the bleeding finally stopped. However, Qin Mu still could not completely heal the national preceptor. He explained that there were now 2 possible choices. The first was to take both Emperor Yangfeng and the national preceptor back to the Great Ruins Inn. Ask the apothecary to treat them. The second was to follow him into the capital. Emperor Yangfeng and the national preceptor looked at each other. Without even needing to discuss it, they made the same decision. The capital. They understood that the capital was already falling into the hands of the Crown Prince, Buddhism, and Taoism. If they did not return, the Duyan Kang Empire would truly lose its rightful leadership. Even though both of them were seriously injured, they still decided to return. But before entering the capital, they needed to conceal their identities. Qin Mu immediately pulled out his butcher's knife. He pressed the national preceptor's head down onto the table and quickly shaved his entire head. Then Qin Mu used incense to create several marks on the national preceptor's scalp that looked like Buddhist monk scars. After that, he took out a yellow monk's robe that he had prepared in advance. Emperor Yangfeng watched the entire scene and rubbed his own bald head. After all, he had already been disguised as a monk himself. The national preceptor could only helplessly accept his fate. Qin Mu also prepared a fake birthmark and painted it on the national preceptor's face, completely transforming his appearance. As for the national preceptor's wife, she was pregnant, so Qin Mu could not shave her head. Instead, he gave her a Taoist robe and disguised her as a female Taoist priest. Once all 3 had been disguised, Qin Mu still did not forget to tease them. He asked whether they wanted to join the Heavenly Saint cult. He declared that joining his sect would at least guarantee that they would have enough food and a place to live. And if they did not know what to do, he could even teach them a few useful crafts so they could make a living. The reunion of the 3 most important figures of Duyan Kang had become both tragic and strangely humorous. 2 men who had once stood at the very peak of political power were now reduced to a bald monk and a badly wounded man, both forced to disguise themselves in order to return to the capital. But behind the humor, a tremendous storm was already approaching. The Crown Prince was preparing for his coronation. Buddhism and Taoism had already taken control of the capital. The various sects were taking advantage of the disaster to divide up the empire's land. And both Emperor Yangfeng and the national preceptor were seriously injured. Qin Mu understood perfectly that this journey back to the capital would not simply be about reclaiming the throne. It could become a battle that determined the fate of the entire Duyan Kang Empire. From the moment the 2 great leaders decided to return to the capital, a shocking counterattack was officially set in motion. After disguising themselves as a monk and a female Taoist priest, Qin Mu still had not abandoned his plan to recruit Emperor Yangfeng and the national preceptor into the Heavenly Saint cult. He bluntly explained that their current situation was extremely dangerous. If their injuries could not be healed, reclaiming the throne would become incredibly difficult. Once they completely lost their cultivation, even if they wanted to join the Heavenly Saint cult later, they might only be able to take relatively minor positions. Therefore, Qin Mu advised them to join immediately. The Heavenly Saint cult still had important positions available, including Heavenly King and Elder. Qin Mu even went so far as to say that if the two of them could never recover their former strength, joining the Heavenly Saint cult would at least guarantee them a stable life. With the organization's various trades and crafts, even people who could no longer fight could still survive comfortably. He then turned to the National Preceptor's wife and asked her to persuade her husband. She simply smiled without answering. At this moment, the National Preceptor suddenly said that if he joined the Heavenly Saint cult, he wanted to become the cult master. Emperor Yangfeng also nodded and said that he wanted to become the cult master as well. The National Preceptor even joked that if His Majesty became the cult master, he would serve as his assistant. Qin Mu's eyes immediately lit up. He was not angry at all. Instead, he seriously asked Emperor Yangfeng whether he really wanted to become the cult master. What surprised Emperor Yangfeng was that Qin Mu was actually willing to give up the position of Heavenly Saint cult master to him. If a former emperor of Duyan Kang became the cult master, then the entire Duyan Kang Empire could effectively become part of the Heavenly Saint cult's power. Emperor Yangfeng immediately found himself in an extremely awkward position. The National Preceptor also understood the situation. He secretly looked at the emperor and signaled that he should not accept the offer. Just as the atmosphere was becoming increasingly awkward, the National Preceptor's wife stepped forward to resolve the situation. She said that if Emperor Yangfeng and the National Preceptor were unwilling to join, then she was willing to join the Heavenly Saint cult. She then asked Qin Mu what position she could take. Qin Mu immediately praised her intelligence. He understood that she had deliberately volunteered in order to prevent Emperor Yangfeng and the National Preceptor from being placed in an awkward position. Qin Mu said that she could take a relatively relaxed position and simply register as a member of the sect. He then asked whether she knew embroidery. If she did, she could become the incense master of the embroidery hall. The National Preceptor's wife happily agreed. Afterward, she pulled the National Preceptor aside and quietly asked him about their chances of winning once they returned to the capital. She wanted to know whether they truly had a chance to reclaim the throne. The National Preceptor thought for a moment and confidently replied that the situation was not yet hopeless. The people of the empire still supported the reforms that Emperor Yangfeng had previously carried out. Within the imperial court, 7 or 8 out of every 10 civil and military officials were still loyal to the emperor and the National Preceptor. Therefore, if the two of them returned to the capital, they still had a chance to eliminate the rebels and restore Emperor Yangfeng to the throne. But the National Preceptor's wife immediately asked a difficult question. Would the Great Thunderclap Monastery and the Dao sect simply stand by and watch? Who could stop the Tathagata and the Dao Master? Could either the National Preceptor or Emperor Yangfeng truly fight against those two terrifying existences? The question left the National Preceptor silent. The situation was not as simple as he had imagined. The two most powerful forces, the Great Thunderclap Monastery and the Dao sect, had already intervened in the capital. Monks and Taoist priests were living inside the residences of princes and powerful officials. Some chanted Buddhist scriptures while others recited Taoist texts. Those who remained loyal to Emperor Yangfeng and the National Preceptor had either been controlled or imprisoned. The National Preceptor's wife pointed out that the two of them currently had almost no usable forces left except for Qin Mu. If they wanted to borrow Qin Mu's strength, they had to give him enough confidence. That was ultimately why the National Preceptor changed his decision. After thinking it over, the National Preceptor walked up to Qin Mu and asked whether the Heavenly Saint cult was still missing a Heavenly King. Qin Mu immediately answered that he was missing the 4th Heavenly King. The National Preceptor did not hesitate any longer. He declared that he would become the 4th Heavenly King of the Heavenly Saint cult. However, he had one condition. Emperor Yangfeng must never become directly involved with the Heavenly Saint cult. The National Preceptor chose to join the sect himself so that he could become the bridge between Emperor Yangfeng and Qin Mu's forces. Emperor Yangfeng was deeply shocked. The National Preceptor had once stood beside him as one of the most powerful figures in the entire empire. Now he was willing to join the Heavenly Saint cult in order to help the emperor reclaim his throne. Emperor Yangfeng could not help but feel that the National Preceptor was being forced to suffer humiliation. Qin Mu simply smiled and explained that Emperor Yangfeng seemed to misunderstand the Heavenly Saint cult. According to Qin Mu, the Heavenly Saint cult was not merely a religion. The sect was using ideas that were close to ordinary people in order to put the principles of the sages into practice. Many of the reforms that Emperor Yangfeng and the National Preceptor had once implemented were actually very similar to the ideals of the Heavenly Saint cult. Qin Mu was about to continue persuading Emperor Yangfeng, but the National Preceptor's wife immediately stopped him. She knew that His Majesty would never easily agree to join the Heavenly Saint cult. Therefore, the most important thing now was to continue moving toward the capital. The group then continued toward Qin Prefecture. The National Preceptor's wife rode on Long Qilin's back, while Qin Mu, Emperor Yangfeng, and the National Preceptor walked below. The two injured men continuously circulated the Overlord Body 3 elixir technique that Qin Mu had taught them in order to recover their vitality. These three men had once stood at the very peak of Duyankang. Yet now they looked like wandering ascetics traveling along the road. Because their injuries had not fully recovered, their speed was not fast. After 2 or 3 days, they finally arrived in Qin Prefecture. The Heavenly Saint cult had already prepared all the medicinal materials that Qin Mu had requested. With the help of these medicines, Emperor Yangfeng's spiritual injuries were finally healed. The external wounds on the National Preceptor's body also completely recovered. However, the most serious problem remained. Divine abilities left behind by that mysterious god were still inside the National Preceptor's body. These abilities were incredibly powerful. They were hidden deep within his body and divine treasures. If the National Preceptor could refine them himself, Qin Mu would eventually have a way to completely heal him. But the problem was that the National Preceptor could not currently use his magical power normally. If he used his power carelessly, the divine abilities left behind inside his body could be activated. Their power could then erupt and cause even more serious damage. Qin Mu looked at the two men before him and could not help sighing inwardly. The two strongest men in the Duyankang Empire had now become two severely injured patients. One had only just recovered his soul. The other still carried terrifying divine abilities inside his body. Neither of them could fight directly. Instead, they needed Qin Mu to protect them on their journey back to the capital. While taking care of the two men, Qin Mu never stopped cultivating. He wasted almost no time. Whenever he walked, the Overlord Body 3 elixir technique automatically circulated through his body, continuously absorbing the power of the 5 luminaries from the heavens. His cultivation continued to rise. Qin Mu also took advantage of every opportunity to practice swordsmanship. Day and night, he practiced the 2 sword techniques taught to him by village chief while searching for a way to perfect them. The National Preceptor noticed Qin Mu's swordsmanship and immediately became interested. He realized that Qin Mu was attempting to merge the 3 basic sword forms he had created into the 2 sword techniques taught by village chief. The National Preceptor found this rather strange. The 2 sword techniques taught by village chief had already reached an extremely profound and almost perfect level. If Qin Mu casually added other sword forms, he might actually destroy the balance of the original techniques. But Qin Mu did not think that way. He wanted to find a completely new path to improve his swordsmanship. During his practice, Qin Mu performed a sword of Founding Emperor. The moment he executed it, he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow. The sword seemed to tell the story of a person standing among mountains and rivers that remained unchanged, while his homeland was already gone. He looked at familiar scenery and remembered the people who had disappeared. There was loneliness and grief within the sword. But there was also the heroic spirit of someone determined to protect the memories of the past. The National Preceptor noticed several weaknesses in Qin Mu's swordsmanship and decided to give him some guidance. He picked up a branch from the ground and used it as a sword. Qin Mu also picked up a branch. The two immediately began exchanging blows. Qin Mu used the 2 sword techniques from the sword diagram to defend himself. Although the National Preceptor had no magical power, his understanding of swordsmanship was still profound. He quickly discovered the weaknesses in Qin Mu's techniques. Again and again, he attacked those weaknesses. In the end, he broke through Qin Mu's sword principle of mountains and rivers. Qin Mu immediately fell into deep thought. The weaknesses pointed out by the National Preceptor were completely different from the weaknesses village chief had previously mentioned. This made Qin Mu realize that these 2 great sword masters followed completely different paths. Village chief's swordsmanship carried powerful emotion, determination, and tragedy. The National Preceptor's swordsmanship, on the other hand, focused more on expansion, transformation, and continuous development. One emphasized emotion and will. The other emphasized variation and evolution. These 2 completely different philosophies naturally produced 2 completely different paths of swordsmanship. Yet this difference was precisely what benefited Qin Mu the most. Village chief had already helped him push the 2 sword techniques to their limits. Qin Mu had almost no room left to improve them. But the National Preceptor opened an entirely new path for him. Qin Mu practiced while walking. His understanding of swordsmanship continued to improve. He felt that he was standing before a completely new realm. It was as if only a thin barrier remained between him and his breakthrough. But no matter how hard he tried, he could not break through that final barrier. The National Preceptor eventually told him to stop practicing. If Qin Mu continued in the same way, he would not make any further progress. To cross that final boundary, he had to comprehend it himself. Emperor Yangfeng immediately understood what the National Preceptor meant. He commented that Qin Mu was now only one step away from becoming a minor grandmaster of swordsmanship. What was even more astonishing was that when Emperor Yangfeng had been Qin Mu's age, he had still been far away from such a level. Emperor Yangfeng revealed that he himself had not reached a similar level until the age of 57. At that time, he had cultivated the Nine Dragons Imperial Emperor technique. By relying on the aura of the Nine Dragons, he sensed the movement of dragon energy and the momentum of the entire world. The ever-changing state of the empire had eventually helped him achieve his breakthrough. Compared with him, Qin Mu was already 30 or 40 years ahead. Qin Mu immediately became curious. He asked what the greatest strength of the Nine Dragons Imperial Emperor technique was. Emperor Yangfeng seriously answered that its greatest strength was transformation. A dragon could become large or small. It could hide or reveal itself. It could fly through the heavens, dive into the sea, disappear into the abyss, or appear in the fields. It could summon clouds and rain, control fire, wind, storms, thunder, and countless other forces. Therefore, the Nine Dragons Imperial Emperor technique was not merely a cultivation method for magical arts. In Emperor Yangfeng's hands, almost any spell, sword technique, or body technique could be used through the transformations of dragon energy. Emperor Yangfeng originally thought Qin Mu would refuse to learn it. After all, Qin Mu was already the leader of the Heavenly Saint cult and possessed countless powerful techniques. But contrary to his expectations, Qin Mu immediately said that he wanted to learn it. Emperor Yangfeng laughed. The Nine Dragons Imperial Emperor technique was originally a secret technique of the Ling family. That was never passed down to outsiders. But he decided to make an exception and teach it to Qin Mu. He began teaching Qin Mu how to circulate the energy of the Nine Dragons and how to transform his vital energy as if it were a dragon. The Nine Dragons Imperial Emperor technique immediately demonstrated how different it was from the Overlord Body 3 Elixir technique. When activated, Qin Mu's vital energy became incredibly abundant and constantly changed its form. Emperor Yangfeng then directly demonstrated the Nine Heavens Divine Dragon Shield. A cloud appeared above his head. Within the cloud, 9 dragons appeared and disappeared, preparing to attack the enemy. However, because Emperor Yangfeng's cultivation had been severely weakened, he quickly exhausted all of his magical power after only a short demonstration. He could only say that he had run out of power, but he believed Qin Mu had already understood the method. And he was right. Qin Mu immediately circulated the Overlord Body 3 Elixir technique and combined it with the 9 Dragons Imperial Emperor technique he had just learned. The atmosphere around them instantly changed. 9 dragons appeared and disappeared in the air. They simultaneously swung their claws. Terrifying power smashed countless rocks within dozens of yards. Emperor Yangfeng and the National Preceptor were both stunned. But the surprise did not end there. The 9 dragons above Qin Mu's head suddenly transformed into fire dragons. The flames spiraled upward and formed a gigantic vortex, lifting everyone into the air. Then the fire dragons transformed again. They rode upon a massive wave of water, lifting the entire group higher. Thunder suddenly roared. Lightning flashed across the sky. One transformation after another appeared before their eyes. Emperor Yangfeng and the National Preceptor could hardly believe what they were seeing. The 9 Dragons Imperial Emperor technique was something that ordinary cultivators might need many years to master. Yet Qin Mu had learned it and was already using it with astonishing skill. His execution was even better than that of many of the princes in the Imperial Academy. After Qin Mu withdrew the 9 Heavens Divine Dragon Shield, Emperor Yangfeng no longer held anything back. He directly passed on everything he had comprehended about the 9 Dragons Imperial Emperor technique. Looking at Qin Mu's terrifying talent, Emperor Yangfeng could not help sighing. If only Qin Mu had been born with the surname Ling. As the group continued toward the capital, they were now only 2 or 3 days away. More importantly, only 3 days remained before the crown prince's coronation. At that moment, a huge bird appeared in the sky. It descended in front of the group and transformed into a young woman dressed in blue. She respectfully reported to Qin Mu that everything had been prepared. Qin Mu simply nodded and told her to go ahead. The woman turned around and ran several steps. 2 wings immediately grew from her back. She then flew directly into the sky. Watching her disappear into the distance, Qin Mu coldly declared that if the Great Thunderclap Monastery and the Dao sect could kill an emperor, then the Heavenly Saint cult could do the same. If the Heavenly Saint cult wanted to become the #1 holy land of the demonic path, then it had to possess enough strength and enough ruthless methods. The National Preceptor immediately became uneasy. He frowned and asked Qin Mu what exactly he intended to do. Qin Mu did not hide anything. He calmly said that his goal was to enter the capital and kill the emperor. The statement instantly made the atmosphere tense. The person Qin Mu wanted to kill was the new emperor who was about to ascend the throne with the support of the Tao sect and the Great Thunderclap Monastery. If Qin Mu succeeded, the Crown Prince's coronation day would no longer be the day he officially became emperor. Instead, it could become the day when the Heavenly Saint cult launched its counterattack. At this moment, Qin Mu was no longer simply escorting Emperor Yang Feng and the National Preceptor back to the capital. He was actively setting up a massive game. On one side was the Crown Prince, backed by Buddhism and Taoism, holding control over the capital and preparing to ascend the throne. On the other side were Emperor Yang Feng and the National Preceptor, two men who had once ruled Duyan Kang but were now both seriously injured. Standing between these two forces was Qin Mu and the Heavenly Saint cult. Emperor Yang Feng had recovered from his spiritual injuries, but his former strength had not yet returned. The National Preceptor's external injuries had healed, but the divine abilities left behind by the mysterious god were still buried deep inside his divine treasures. Neither man was capable of fighting at full strength. Therefore, Qin Mu had to become the spearhead. He had to protect the two great leaders, continue cultivating, improve his swordsmanship, master the Nine Dragons Imperial Emperor technique, and at the same time prepare the Heavenly Saint cult for the coming battle. Only 3 days remained before the Crown Prince's coronation. Only 2 or 3 days remained before Qin Mu reached the capital. And his final declaration had made his determination perfectly clear. He did not intend to quietly return Emperor Yang Feng to the capital and help him slowly reclaim his authority. He intended to strike directly at the center of power and destroy the entire situation that the Tao sect and the Great Thunderclap Monastery had carefully built. The day of the Crown Prince's coronation could very well become a day when blood flowed through the streets of the capital. A confrontation between the Heavenly Saint cult and the powerful forces standing behind the new emperor was now unavoidable. And with that, episode 96 comes to an end. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the latest developments in the next episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in episode 97.